And I think the slide should appear soon.
Yeah,
and then I'll get going. Okay, excellent. So the question to be considered today is the role of gender in constructing a society and categorizing people, rather than talking about biological sex or sexuality. Now, for most Westerners, the question of gender has seemed traditionally to be quite obvious, that there are two genders. Now, more recently, there have been variations in this concept, but for the most part, this tends to have moved between two binary poles. And there is often an assumption that it is in some way largely fixed at birth and synonymous with biology. Now, this is changing, but nevertheless, that tends to be the norm, at least in the Western tradition. Sexuality, on the other hand, is seen as much more fluid. But what I want to suggest is that this is not universally the case in history or even now. So in the West, we tend nowadays to use a lot of terms, and they're not always talking about the same thing. However, there is, in the way the Western societies use the terminology, a heavy emphasis on biology. In other words, talking about, if you will, people's sexual plumbing or sexual activities, who someone sleeps with. However, what I want to suggest in this talk is that historically cultures have tended to categorize people and their activities in a different way, which focuses on the concept of gender, and very often has little interest or discussion about their sexual activities or attractions. These may well be a part of it, but they tend not to be a defining feature. So I thought it would be good to provide a list of cultures and the countries they're in now, which have, or until relatively recently had, more than two genders. Those highlighted in yellow are third-gendered individuals who, in the terminology that is very often used today, would be considered biologically female, at least at birth. All the rest would be, as some people would say, biologically male. The point for these cultures is that biology is not necessarily a guide to later gender. In the West, we might ask parents with an infant, what is it? And by that we mean, is it a boy or a girl? If you asked a parent, what is it? And they said a boy, and you said, no, I mean straight or gay, that would seem strange, as sexuality is seen as a characteristic which only becomes apparent later in life. For these cultures, the same can be said for the gender of some people. Birth and biology may tend to a particular gender, but it is not a sure sign. In the same way one might presume that a male child will be statistically a straight man, there's no guarantee. The child might become gay or bisexual or any other variety of outcomes, and in some cultures, the child might become up to two and sometimes more genders. And the list continues, which I hope is already suggesting how much more common the phenomenon is, or in some cases was, than one might expect. So in other words, when you hear quite often a discussion that says there have always been two genders, you have to say, well, that's, in many cultures, that's simply not true. I also thought it might be useful to have a visual representation of countries which contain, or until relatively recently contain, cultures within them with more than two genders. Now, this is not to suggest that this map or the list are entirely complete, but this is the minimum about which there is relatively good information available. Nor does the map suggest that the entire nation colored in red is somehow have more than two genders, but rather there are cultures living within these now modern nations which have more than two genders. So having identified these cultures with more than two genders are not uncommon, let's look at them in closer detail. And one of the things I want to do is to start with ideas about deities, which often mirror social ideas. In other words, if you live in a culture that has more than two genders, you may well live in a culture where deities have more than two genders. So the idea that gods can change gender is common in polytheism. Indeed, gods can change species. Just think of Zeus as a bull or eagle. In monotheism, God, while often thought or spoken of as father, is actually genderless, as are people after the resurrection in Christian thought, which explains why marriage ends at death. So this example, this is a Hindu god who is a composite and androgynous form of Shiva and his consort Parvati. They are depicted as half male and half female, split vertically, with the right half usually being the male Shiva, illustrating his traditional attributes. They represent the synthesis of masculine and feminine energies in the universe and illustrate how the female principle of God is inseparable from, or the same as, according to some interpretations, the male principle of God, Shiva. However, this still suggests a largely binary construct, even where, as in the subcontinent in Hindu cultures, multiple genders exist. The Greco-Roman world, in addition to gods and goddesses with a wide range of sexual tastes and some gender transformation, was also working in a largely binary construct. Thus, Hermaphroditus was the god of hermaphrodites and of effeminate men. He was numbered among the winged love gods and was the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, the gods of male and female sexual activity. Some say he was once a handsome youth who attracted the love of a naiad nymph called Salmachus. She prayed to be united with him forever and a god. In answer to her prayer, and in the kind of weird, sarcastic way that Greco-Roman gods often behave, merged their two forms into one. At the same time, her spring acquired the property of making men who bathed in its waters soft and effeminate. But there were also male versions of Aphrodite. So, for example, the statue on the left, where Aphrodite, the female goddess, was seen as having male attributes in her own right. In other words, you effectively have three different mythical beings here: Aphrodite on the right, Aphroditus on the left, and Hermaphroditus in the middle. But let's move into the realm of the real. And I'll start with the example of a third gender, which I think probably most people are familiar with, even if they don't realize they're familiar with it. And that is the Kathoi in Thailand. In English, we say ladyboys, because we can't express the concept of a third gender. Now, this is very much embedded in Thai culture, both traditionally, but even in a more modern Western sense. So in 2004, the Chiang Mai Technology School allocated a separate bathroom for Kathois with an intertwined male and female symbol on the door. The students were required to wear male clothing at school, but were allowed to sport feminine hairstyles. The restroom had stalls, but no urinals. But the question then arises, how does one become a Kathoi? As I said, we say an infant and ask, what is it? Never what's its sexuality. We assume that comes later. These cultures may assume male, female, but accept a fluidity, which later may produce a third gender, or in some, as we'll see, a fourth or fifth. But it is not necessarily about choice. Communities may well encourage a child to become a third gender because there is a need for a person to be a third gender. And that's because in most of these cultures, they're very traditional in having gendered roles. So specific genders do and don't do certain things. And some of those activities are done traditionally by third genders, and the other two genders don't do them. And in Thai culture, one of the traditional roles of the Kathoi is to care for elderly parents, so siblings with their families are not burdened. So having one of the children become a Kathoi would be good and good fortune. Now, some of you may also be familiar with the third gender peoples of the subcontinent. Now, Sanskrit has three genders grammatically: male, female, and not male, not female. In English, we have two, male, female, and then neuter, which has no gender, as opposed to a gender, which is simply not male and not female. Thus, in English, we say he, she, and it. Sanskrit says he, she, and not he, she. This is a distinction. And there are more examples than just hijras. In the foothills of the Himalayas, some individuals who may have been biologically classed as females at birth adopt the role as a sadhin, renounce marriage, and dress and work as men, but retain female names and female pronouns. A late 19th century anthropologist noted the existence of a similar role in Madras, that of the Basivi. The existence of a third gender has now been legally accepted in a formal basis in Pakistan and India. Indeed, Pakistan recognized third gendered in sort of legal documentation before India did. The key point is the taking on the appearance of another gender, but not necessarily the social roles. And indeed, hijras have their own unique gendered role, which relates to good and bad luck. So for example, it's important to have a hijra at a wedding and near to the birth of a child as a blessing. However, at most other times, they are seen as impure or bad luck. Before the arrival of the British, hijras often owned land and passed it on to their adopted hijra children. In other words, you had, if you will, dynasties of hijras. The British, to stamp out the practice, which they thought was sodomitical and or transvestitism, allowed only blood inheritance. This forced most hijras off the land and into an urban underclass, which is where they remain to this day. So at the moment, you would associate hijras with urban environments in India, but traditionally, that was not the case. Now, we also, I mentioned Pakistan being a Muslim country. Well, the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. Indeed, the three largest Muslim countries by the size of their populations, Indonesia, Pakistan, and India, all have three genders. The point is, as with the Hanith in the Arabian Peninsula, the focus is on dress and lifestyle in the sense of behavior in public rather than sexual activity. As with the Kathoi in Thailand, and one can see that this is a cultural commonality that must predate the arrival of Islam in Indonesia, as the Kathoi and Waria are clearly closely connected culturally. Anyway, there's not just a social acceptance of the third gender, but social celebration with beauty pageants, and in Indonesia, quite a lot of magazines that cater to and are about Waria. And you see the same sort of celebration in Polynesia. So this is a pageant for Samoan Fa'afine. In Polynesia, third gender people are often key in the hospitality industry in front of house roles, as they have a tradition associated with hospitality and welcoming. That is a specific third gender role, which is not about a biological male taking on female gender roles, although there is a taking on a female attire. And this gives me a chance to talk about a very interesting discussion I had. I was at a conference in the States on sort of student exchanges, and I was chatting to two women who were from the Marshall Islands. And I knew that the Marshall Islands, being part of Polynesia, had more than two genders. But I didn't know whether this was something one talked about. So I said to the two ladies, one of whom was in her 30s and one in her 50s, I know the Marshall Islands has three genders. Is this a taboo subject, or can we talk about it? The woman in her 50s turned around and just walked away from the table. The woman in her 30s burst out laughing and said, "You'll have gathered from my colleague's reaction that no, it's not something we talk about." And I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry then, don't worry about it." She said, "No, let me rephrase that. We don't talk about it to people that look like you." And she said, "Because the last time we did, you used it as an excuse for colonizing us, because you said that our culture needed to be fixed because it was somehow demonic in tolerating transvestitism or sodomy." And I think that's a very telling story about the place of third gendered people in cultures which have then come in contact with Western cultures. Now, if we move to North America, we see the same sort of reality. So on the right, you have a person who was referred to as squaw, which is the traditional word used for an indigenous woman wife. Squaw Jim on the right, who worked for the US Cavalry along with their wife. So what is this person's gender? Many American Indian societies have 3 genders. Indeed, some have 4, and Navajos and Hopis can have up to 5, depending on a complex interplay of biology, role choice, gender roles in the society, and indeed sexual attraction. Here, there is both an emphasis upon appearance, but also mannerisms. Some Amerindian languages have different grammars depending on the speaker's gender, and 2 spirits may blend these. And this is not uncommon. There are other cultures that do that as well, where men speak using certain words and certain grammar forms that signify when they're speaking that they're a male, and women have different grammar forms, and 2 spirits will mix and match. Also, 2 spirit very often perform specific gender roles, for example, in agriculture and in religion. Traditionally, in many of these cultures, agriculture was not a role for a warrior, the male. But quite often, the family unit might want someone who was physically stronger to do some of the agricultural work, and very often that role was filled by a 3rd gendered person. Religion was an important place for 2 spirit people in many North American Indian cultures, as they're often seen as more in touch with the spirits because they aren't burdened with mundane matters like family and children. And in these cultures, a man might marry someone that the Christian Westerners might say is another man, but they would not be perceived that way. And again, as with the Kathoi in Thailand, a village or family might want one of the children to become another gender because it's useful. So if your 2 spirit shaman died, you need a new shaman. And what you would then do is look around for a child who was exhibiting characteristics that might suggest they were 2 spirit, and you might then encourage that child to be 2 spirit. So it's questions of choice and sort of how society works together are really interesting in these discussions of multigendered societies. Muxes in Mexico live in a socially sanctioned netherworld between the 2 genders. And I like this image because it shows Muxes actually in a church service. Muxe is a Zapotec word derived from the Spanish mujer, or woman. It is reserved for people who were born and perceived to be males at birth, have felt themselves drawn to living as a woman, anticipating roles set out for them by the community. Not all Muxe express their identities the same way. Some dress as women and take hormones to change their bodies nowadays. Others favor male clothes. What they share is that the community accepts them as somewhere in between. Many in the Zapotec community believe that Muxe have special intellectual and artistic gifts. This highlights an element I've touched upon with Hydras and others. 3rd gender people are often seen as having additional special roles, good, bad luck, artistic abilities, shamanistic, ritualist, religious roles, as with the Amerindians. Now, I put this slide up as an example where this can be very interesting. Can you guess the gender or biological sex when you don't understand the dress code rules? So on the left in both of these pictures is a wakashu, and these were often the pages of the samurai and were extolled as the objects of homoerotic poetry and love in medieval and early modern Japan. Indeed, Ihara Sakaku, who's often seen as comparable to Shakespeare in Japanese literature, created someone we would now label as a bisexual main character in The Life of an Amorous Man in 1682. However, as in the Marshall Islanders encounter I mentioned, this aspect of Japanese culture and literature was used to justify Western ideas about the immoral inferiority of the East and the Oriental. The key point to which I'll return is that dress and hairstyle are essential elements of identity. Here they mark out the person on the left as not yet a gendered man. In both images, the person on the left is what we would term an adolescent male. And you can see this by the clothing, but particularly the hairstyle. Now, I wanted to talk about a couple of examples within Europe itself. And one I want to start with is sworn virgins, and that's because it's not always, as you might have been thinking, that mostly these are people that most would categorize as biologically male at birth, and have then in some way taken on female characteristics. We've already seen how Amerindian two-spirits could be biologically female, and the Sandheen of India. A similar reality exists in Europe. The term sworn virgin has come to refer to a traditional social role in the highlands of Albania and Montenegro, as well as in several other Serbo-Croat areas. Among the Highlander groups, a cross-cultural clan-based orientation and highly marked sexual roles has created a system where there is, in cases, a shortage of adult males. One suitable alternative is the sworn virgin, a female-born person who takes on the social but not sexual role of a man. They dress, work, and live as men, but remain chaste and unmarried. And another example is mostly associated with the area around Naples. And the understanding of this role, as I'll suggest, has changed over time. So first I want to sort of talk about the contemporary role. Again, I've given you an image on the left of a scene in church. Most times a feminiello now would be seen as an individual, as a male transvestite, but not simply a male homosexual. It refers in Naples now to men who, in addition to their natural inclinations, have been as in some way gendered to dress and behave in women, and very often engage in prostitution. But they're male. They know it and everyone knows it. It bears emphasis that feminiello is not a derogatory term. The grammar is clear. The diminutive is a term, i.e. LLO, is a term of endearment, and the masculine suffix O is attached to the word for woman. Roughly translate as a little man woman. It's not an insult, but the understanding of this type of gendered role is recent. Traditionally, and this is where the picture on the right comes in, this was a different gender role for someone who was biologically male. A man being involved sexually with this gender was not committing sodomy or engaging in what we would now consider to be a homosexual act. It was a third gendered person. Now, as I suggested at the beginning, there are lots of other examples. I want to just touch upon a couple. The term huevadoche is Spanish slang for a specific genetic condition. It originates in the Dominican Republic, where more than 3 dozen cases have occurred in the small village of Salinas, all descended from a single individual. It stands for the colloquial expression huevo a las 12, which translates literally as eggs at 12, and eggs being a common slang term for testicles. The person at birth presents as female or possibly intersex, but at puberty develops testicles and more male sex traits. It is also known locally as machi-hembras, or male-female. A similar cluster of cases among the Simbari of the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea is locally known by a word that translates as female thing transforming into male thing. Among the 19th century Chukchi of Siberia, the soft men were a category of biologically male shamans who, as they aged, adopted first female hairstyles, then female dress, and finally married males. They were very often hated and scorned because of their shamanistic power, but also feared because they were seen as having enormously important power. So while feared, they were also useful as shamans. So we see many cultures with more than 2 genders, where gender is about roles, clothing, behavior, sometimes sexual partners. But increasingly, these are being conflated with newly arriving and newly spreading ideas from the West about sexuality. But these ideas assume 2 genders and are really about sexual partners with little or no interest in social roles, clothing, and cultural behavior. So I want to end by suggesting that there are some generalities, and by generalities I mean very, very general generalities. There are specific roles, often adoption of the dress of the gender not associated with the biology. But sociocultural roles, not sexual acts, predominate. In other words, people in these genders are defined by what they do in society, not what they do in a bedroom. Social acceptance is there, but it is often under pressure as a result of Western ideas, originally with Western colonialism and imperialism, the idea that these people were somehow inherently immoral, that they were transvestites or even worse, sodomites, but also positive ideas coming in now that this is really just a form of sexuality under a different name. These cultures don't see it that way. And in fact, there's quite a debate in Thai culture where traditional Thais are very upset that ladyboys are very often self-identifying as passive gay males, and this is seen as not the way to understand the Cathoi, because it's now putting the focus on sex rather than on social roles. And in a society where we're talking about sex is taboo, you can see why that would be problematic. Now, interestingly, most are biologically male, which raises some fascinating questions about how maleness is constructed in most cultures, which might explain the tendency of or need for males to move into a third category. But the key thing is that it's easy to think of cultures with more than 3 genders and think how progressive and how modern. But what I'm suggesting is that these cultures do have more than 2 genders, but all of these genders have very specific roles in society. And that really is the key defining characteristic, and not really anything to do with sexuality. Right, thank you very much. And so I think we'll open that up to questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. That was, as always, fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time there. We're open for questions, guys. So if you've got any questions, please start putting them in the chat. Again, if you're not sure where the chat is, if you just click that little purple icon, it will open the Collaborate panel, and then you'll see the speech bubble, and you can just put your questions in there. So we'll give you guys just a minute to start sending in some questions.
And a minute for my throat to recover.
And no one's used to talking this much these days because you don't see anybody. I've got a question. I'll kick off with while we're waiting for others. How to word this? You spoke about, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but one of the cultures, which was quite heavily affected by, the British going in and kind of changed. Was that a problem in a lot of cultures across the board with colonialism?
Yes, and it's not particularly the British. You find the Spanish, the French, Portuguese all react very similarly. They come in contact with what are largely polytheistic pagan cultures, and they really don't like a lot of what they see. They don't like to see idols. They quite often don't like to see the sacrificing of animals, let alone the sacrificing of human beings. They don't like seeing many gods, all of which they just interpret as being demonic. And one of the things they do see in some cultures is more than 2 genders. And it is then problematic, because for Westerners, what they see is very often someone they perceive of as being a man, dressed like a woman, performing roles that they might associate with women, or they might not associate them with any specific gender, and often having cohabiting arrangements with someone they perceive of as male. So they see sodomy and they see transvestitism, and so they want to stamp it out. And they argue that this is proof that these are cultures that are demonic, that have been somehow too long controlled by Satan, and they need to be fixed.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Rachel. She's asked, why do you think there is so much resistance to recognizing more than 2 genders in the UK now and elsewhere?
I think it's because I think that what is being suggested in our culture is not really necessarily recognizing more than 2 genders. It's recognizing sort of 2 genders and then a category that is kind of not one of the other 2. And I think that the issue we tend to have is the West has so long equated biology with gender, and gender roles with the biology. In other words, if we said, 50 years ago, medical practitioners who were nurses were women because women were nurses, and medical practitioners who were men were doctors because doctors were men. So that what I mean by gender roles. And in the West, those gender roles have been hooked almost exclusively to biology. And so it becomes then problematic when you try to suggest something else. And what I'm saying is in other cultures that there hasn't been this sort of connecting with the biology so much, or biology has been less of an issue.
Thank you very much. The next one is, were these practices accepted rather than condemned in any lands that were colonized?
No, not really. I mean, my conversation with the lady from the Marshall Islands was really interesting because, you know, she said, look, everyone has a third gendered relative, you know, these are all part of our culture. And I said, but surely Polynesian cultures are not just Christian, but are quite conservative Christian. She said, yeah, of course, but the Bible doesn't talk about third gendered peoples. And I thought, now see, that was very interesting. So they knew that this is not a conversation you had with Westerners, because Westerners were going to go, that's not a third gendered person, that's a transvestite. And in their minds, they're going, it's a third gendered person, and that's not sort of covered by the Bible, so not an issue. And that, you know, is really interesting. So condemned by the colonizers and imperial powers, yes. The interesting thing is to what extent the native populations then take on that view of reality, and it then affects the way in which they perceive their, if you will, their third gendered relatives. Some cultures, as in Polynesia, doesn't seem to be an issue. They just don't care. In other places, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, you get a real sense of this can't have ever existed, because if it had existed, then we did need to be colonized.
Okay, got it, thank you. The next question is kind of following on from one of the ones we had before, but is it more usual for cultures to have more than two genders? Is the UK and Western pattern not actually the norm?
Well, I mean, if you just think about the subcontinent as about being a quarter of the world's population, that's a significant. So then you start to say, well, what do you mean by norm? Probably something like 35–40% of the world's population live in cultures that have or traditionally have had more than two genders. Does that mean that there is a norm? I think at those levels you start to say it's hard to talk about a norm. Okay,
thank you. The next person says, thank you as always for a great presentation. I should know this, but realize I do not. In Sanskrit, is there male, female, not male/female, and it, identifying non-animate, or just male, female, not male/female?
No, as far as I understand it, Sanskrit's a language with grammatical gender. So rather like, you know, German that has three, male, female, and it, and French, Spanish, and Italian, which just have male and female. But in the way Sanskrit understands that third gender, they don't understand it as being a genderless grammatical usage. They perceive of it as having gender. It's just that gender isn't male or female. It's, I guess you could say, somewhere in between, if you want to put it crudely.
Okay. The next one is, how has colonialism impacted societies where multiple genders existed? Has this changed the way gender is viewed in these cultures, or have these societies continued, without being impacted significantly?
Yeah, as I was just suggesting, it varies. So in some cultures, Polynesia, it seems to have had little impact. In subcontinent cultures, the impact was more on the fact that Hydras effectively were stripped of their property wealth. So that's had, I mean, obviously that's a significant impact on them, but it doesn't seem to have necessarily affected the way the culture viewed them, other than they are, in addition to now being good luck or bad luck, they're also seen now as being really poor urban underclass. Whereas, say, in 1650, they wouldn't have been viewed that way. I mean, very often they had significant land holdings because they've got land grants from the Mogul ruling class. But it does seem to have had an effect in many sub-Saharan African cultures, where the the indigenous population taking on board the Western view of sin, now see that sort of behavior as sinful, and that any culture that had it needs to have it stamped out, and therefore simply says it never existed, that this was just Westerners making up lies about it.
Okay, thank you. The next person says, fascinating talk, Bill, thank you. Did having useful social roles protect individuals of a third gender so that there was no ostracizing of them, if they were overtly sexual, for example, in public?
Yeah, well, almost all of these cultures being overtly sexual is taboo, regardless of your gender. I mean, Thai culture, two girls, two Catholics, and two boys might walk down the street holding hands, but not mixed across those genders. That would be socially unacceptable. So what we might consider as public displays of affection are perceived of as being something that's only acceptable if they're displaying the affection between friends. That they shouldn't be displaying affection which is in some way sexual. I think it is much more that certain activities in society were perceived of, for whatever reason, as not being female or male, and or because people, it's a sort of chicken and egg, isn't it? If you just sort of had a village where no one knew anything and not going on, and you say, okay, some people just don't seem to behave the way everyone else behaves, what are we going to do with them? How are we going to describe them? Well, you might describe them by gender roles, you might describe them by sexuality, you might kill them. And so it's sort of hard to know when these things develop, but over time it's clear that certain activities in some cultures are seen as things that women don't do and men don't do, but they need to be done. And so someone else gets to do them.
Okay, thank you. The next person says, you spoke about the Italian third gender as one with whom homosexual relationships were permitted. Is it possible this gender was created as a way of these relationships being viewed as acceptable in society at the time?
Yeah, again, sort of a chicken and egg. I mean, it certainly serves that, it does do that. It's a question, I guess it's the word created that always has to me the idea that sort of, a committee sat down and decided this. I think it might be better to say if it came into being in the culture and became acceptable in the culture as a way of sort of coping with relationships that would otherwise be problematic, then yes, probably.
Super, thank you. The next person says, great talk as usual. It seems that religion had a great impact on how we viewed other cultures in the past. Now we appear to be moving away from formalized religion. Will this improve our attitude to these sections in our other cultures?
Well, this is what I think is very problematic, because if you look at these cultures, I think most Westerners would look at them and be rather upset by the strictness of the gender roles. I mean, in our own culture, the idea, I'm sorry, you can't do that because you're a woman, is just not an acceptable thing to say. But most of these cultures are very traditional that way. So that's part of the kind of weird thing about it. In the past, the West would have looked at it and said, this is unacceptable because you've got this third gender that might be wearing the wrong set of clothes. Now we look at it and go, yeah, but you've got these, really strict gender roles, and that's not right. So we're wanting a fluidity in gender roles in society, and we tend to categorize people's behavior by who they sleep with. And these cultures just simply don't do that. Now the next question, Chloe asked us about language. Languages are weird. I mean, there are European languages where you can't say he or she. You have to say the man, you have to say man, woman. There's simply no pronouns for gender. And some language, I mean, English basically has no grammatical gender whatsoever. I mean, I guess some people refer to ships as she's still, but by and large, if it's a living thing, it gets gender, and if it's an inanimate object, it's just an it. So, but there is lots of variation in cultures, everything from, ones that will have, more than two gender concepts, as well as an inanimate concept to ones that simply don't have that concept of grammatical gender at all.
Thank you. The next person saying a very interesting presentation and really good food for thought. It's kind of similar to kind of what we've covered, but it's still relevant, I think. It's in with the notion of religion affecting social acceptance of gender. How do you think or hope the dynamic may play out between biological sex and gender in the West going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, one would think that what you're aiming for is a society which by and large doesn't care if a woman is a doctor or a man is a nurse, and therefore doesn't care if what clothes people wear. I mean, in a sense, it's sort of all of that together. I mean, if you don't care that someone who is female has a role that traditionally men did, then why would you care that the woman wears men's clothes? And in fact, we don't. 100 years ago, a woman who dressed like Marlene Dietrich in the movie in a tuxedo, that was transvestitism. It's almost impossible now to talk about a woman in drag. But men can still be in drag. And that even suggests a sort of a shifting there. And you know, you'd think you'd get to a point where you just simply wouldn't particularly care a great deal about the idea that somehow biological sex must be attached to the way people dress, walk, talk, or anything else. And that's what these gender roles to a certain extent do, and that's what we've done in the past as well. We just tend to have binary, other cultures have more.
Super, thank you. The next person says, the UK is quite widely regarded in the Anglosphere as one of the chief exporters of contemporary transphobia. How much would you say this is linked to and shaped by British history and colonial ideas about gender sex binaries versus some other more contemporary impulse?
Well, I think it is still very much shaped by the fact that Western culture generally still sees both looks at people in the world and sees binary, and still very much connects that binary to physical plumbing. And that's problematic for all kinds of reasons. I mean, first of all, you know, it's something like 1 in 1,000 babies is visibly intersexed at birth. Well, so what? What does that mean? Because you know, doctors don't walk into the parents after delivery and go, "Congratulations, you have a choice." That's just not the way it works. And that's because we have this sort of a binary fixation, and we still have gender reveal parties. You know, is it a boy, is it a girl? We use blue and pink. 120 years ago, the colors were exactly reversed. And you think, but in a sense, why does that matter? And I think it gets back to what I was saying, this idea that in the West, because we fixate with gender being binary and fix it on physical plumbing, you do get this sense where it's perfectly normal to ask parents, what is your child? And what you're asking them is, what is their physical plumbing? In other cultures, that would seem kind of, I mean, you might ask, but you might also be aware that, well, they could end up being a Catholic. So in a sense, what does it matter? I mean, can you imagine walking up to parents on the street in a shopping mall and saying, oh, you know, what is the child? Oh, it's a boy. Oh, wonderful. Is it gay? And that would be seen as being such a weird thing to ask. And that's because sexuality is not pinned necessarily onto this binary construct and onto physical plumbing in quite the same way that gender is in the West.
Thank you very much. I am actually seeing a lot of stuff on social media. You know, you're talking about gender reveals and a lot of terminology sort of changing. You know, people are saying birth gender rather than, you know, that is the actual gender of the child, which is quite interesting. Do you think that that's going to be happening a lot more?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I'm still amazed by this sort of color coding of babies, which just strikes me as being a sort of a very strange thing. And if you say, you know, where does this, you know, as Joni just said in the last question, you know, where does this sort of come from? Well, children aren't stupid. They pay attention to what their parents are saying and doing, and you know, if you've got little kids sitting in front of you, little 5-year-olds, and all the parents are sitting around going, oh well, Johnny's a really, a ladies' man, he's got all these girlfriends. Well, Johnny's going to learn fairly quickly what he ought to have and what he ought not to have. And in the same way, Johnny's really good at sport. Well, Janie sitting there is going to sort of get a message as well, because kids they're sponges. They listen, they pick up all of that, and that's, I think that's what's happening in the West now, where there's a little more sensitivity about that. And I saw recently there was a survey done both in Britain and in the US, and it found that only 40% of young adults, I think under 25 years old, said that they were only attracted to the opposite gender. Now that means 60% were quite happy to say in a survey, yeah, I'm attracted to people of other biologies. Now that's interesting, because I don't think that 40 years ago you'd have got that result. And that's probably suggesting that what they're hearing when they're 5 years old with the parents sitting around is what was different from what was being said 40 years ago.
Yes, thank you so much. We've got another one. Do you think the fact that transvestism, if I'm saying that probably not saying that right, sorry, has died out as a concept when applied to women due to male seemingly being seen as a default concept in lots of ways for quite a large period of time, at least in the late 18th and 19th century?
Yes, absolutely, and even longer than that. I mean, the reality is that societies in the West can understand a woman wanting to be a man and dress like a man and have male jobs, because that's evolving. They have a lot harder time seeing a man wanting to dress like a woman, behave like a woman, and have women gender roles, because that's devolving. And that is really based on concepts of where women and men are in a sort of a hierarchy of creation. Women are seen as being closer to the animal world. They are less in control of themselves. They are weaker, not necessarily physically, but sort of mentally, spiritually, all of that. And so so in a sense, a woman is understood to try to better herself by taking on male attributes, whereas a man doing it is seen as somehow doing something strange. And I mean, it's not just clothes. I mean, I'm constantly fascinated by the fact that in almost all professions where 50 years ago you had a different word, so you had actor, actress, and now actor, and you think, so why did everyone get to become the male version? Why didn't society agree that everyone who does that job is now going to be called actress? Well, because you know what you aspired to and what no one should aspire to. So no man was going to allow himself to be called an actor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think there's some really interesting concepts, and I think, Samantha, you're absolutely right. But I think it's much longer than the late 18th and 19th century. This is really hard baked into a lot of Western thinking.
So interesting. Thank you. That is it for questions in the chat. Unless we've still got plenty of time, we allowed an extra 15 minutes over the hour in case we run over with questions. So we'll give you guys another just minute or two to put in any last questions you might have. But if there aren't any, then we'll just wrap up in a second. Chloe just saying it's interesting as well that in some languages, female forms of professions, etc., are now coming into existence, so that the default isn't male.
Yeah, so in places like France and Spain, now that women are doing roles that traditionally were male, they're effectively inventing female words for it. And that raises all kinds of other sort of interesting issues of why you do that. But I just think it's fascinating that overwhelming, you see this idea that somehow a woman aping a man is either not threatening or seen as being understandable, but somehow the idea that, well, I mean, I guess, you sort of say, does a man really want to walk in high heels? Because as far as I know, for most women, they're not very comfy. So you'd sort of say in that direction. But, the idea that women would want to put on sort of three-piece suits to go to work, I mean, no one would really think about it if they did, but you'd sort of say, surely a nice loose cotton dress would be a whole lot more comfortable than that. So why are you doing it? But it doesn't raise any issues. But if a man went to work in a nice, you know, sunny cotton dress, everyone would think, why are you doing that? Are you making a political statement? Are you trying to get attention? What's the purpose of doing that? You might just think, well, because it's considerably more comfortable. And then, of course, there are lots of cultures where there's not a whole lot of difference, sometimes only just in color, between the clothing styles. I mean, so there are some cultures in Oman, for example, where it's a question of sort of plain colors or stripes and things like that. And the third gender will sort of mix and match, rather like some do with the grammar they use. I once had a wonderful conversation. I was at a student fair in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and I was wearing a kilt. Now, as you can imagine, I was like the most popular tourist attraction at the event. Everyone came to have their picture taken with me. And I was speaking to two Saudi guys. One was an older guy, and one was a guy must have been in his late 20s. And they were both saying, wow, we really like that. It's such a cool outfit. And the older guy said, but, you know, can I just ask, why a skirt? And the younger guy laughed and said, look at us, we're both wearing dresses. And I said, I really can't comment. But the older guy laughed and said, yeah, but I never thought about what we look like from his perspective, as opposed to what he looks like from our perspective. And I thought that was really interesting.
So Samantha again is asking, do you think lots of the hierarchy between this enforced and religiously mandated binary leaked into things such as the categorization of mammals as primarily being categorized as the breast, as to solidify scientifically this binary categorization?
Oh, well, you know, the development of categorizations for not just animals but plants in the 18th century is a fascinating discussion all on its own, and how it's a wonderful insight into the way the Western mind works, and is very, very problematic. But you're right, the idea that somehow, you know, certain creatures are a group simply because they not just because they have live birth, but because they have live birth and mammaries, is a category, is really fascinating. Here in France, they still call women in male jobs with a nod to male dominance, for example, Madame la Mère, as if they have to keep the le in order to just, yes, exactly. And okay, partially that sometimes is just the way the language works and its way tradition works, but you're right. It very often tends to be in that kind of a direction. Actor wins out, not actress. And I mean, what's wrong with Madame la Mère? I mean, why would you not say that? But you don't.
The next person say, a fascinating talk, thank you. Pantomime allows men and women to swap roles, the pantomime dame and the principal boy. The audience watches happily. Do you have a comment on this?
Well, I mean, I can say as an American that, one, pantomime is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. And secondly, the British fascination with male transvestitism is deeply, deeply strange. Because that is not a fundamental part of American humor or American vaudeville humor, and yet it is very much a part of British vaudeville humor. And again, you could sort of say, well, what does that suggest? Well, what it suggests is what I've been talking about, which is cultures do things very, very differently. And sometimes you can't really figure out why it's the way it is, but it just is. And it is certainly the case that men dressing in women's clothes is much more a part of British culture than it ever is in America. I mean, all you have to do is see, you know, the university rugby team on a Friday night out, when dressing as women is seen to be funny. Most Americans would not think that that was funny, and certainly not for kind of American football players. That would be just seen as a very strange thing to do. So in one culture, it's seen as being funny. In another culture, it's seen as being strange. And that just highlights what I'm suggesting here, is that something that was seen as perfectly natural in Polynesian society when Western viewers saw it was sin. That's more extreme, but it does suggest what I'm saying, that, you know, cultures, English-speaking cultures that may see themselves in many ways very, very similar can have very, very different cultural constructions. And one of the different constructions here that you're talking about is sort of the construction of humor. I mean, I simply do not get pantomimes. I mean, I watch them and I don't understand why they're funny. I don't understand why anyone is there. They just seem to me to be weird. And that's just cultural.
Yeah, it's never ever occurred to me until right this minute that pantomime might be an odd thing because it's just something that I grew up with, and it's something we always, just accept as part of our culture.
Exactly.
No, they're not.
I mean, and in fact, what it is it's a tradition of 18th century theatre that has continued into the modern day in Britain, which simply doesn't exist in the Americas, where theatre in that period never got a deep root. American theatre is a 19th century phenomenon, and by then, men were not taking female roles. You didn't have this custom of talking back to a dialogue between the audience and the stage. That's a very 18th century sort of phenomenon. I went to the University of William and Mary in colonial Williamsburg, put on 18th century plays. And one of the things we were told is that we were meant to engage with the actors. So if you booed, they booed back. And if you clapped a lot, they would redo the scene. Now that's kind of forcing us in America to participate in an 18th century phenomenon that if you were British, you'd have just sat there and thought, this is pantomime. Why do you need an instruction booklet on this? This is just pantomime. Well, it was weird when I did it then, and I still find it weird with pantomime. Yeah, in ancient Greek theater, there were only male players. I mean, that is very often the case in cultures, that theater is very often dominated by or entirely one gender or the other. I always think it's great fun that the Greek word for actor is in fact where we get our word hypocrite from, hypokrites, because an actor is fundamentally someone who is duplicitous. There's someone pretending to be someone else. In the same way that hysteria is a word we get from the Greek, which has to do with the womb, which is why only women could be hysterical.
As Chloe just said, that's very interesting. It certainly is very interesting. There's all these things you don't think about.
Yeah. And of course, they thought women had a problem with their wombs because they thought wombs moved. And I dare say that if a woman's womb did wander around her body, she probably would be hysterical. But that was clearly so there a different concept of biology produced a very different concept of a disease that was gender specific because it was biologically specific. And you can just kind of see how weirdly cultures can organize these things and how differently cultures can organize these things. And of course, I guess the point is that there's not a right or a wrong, but obviously when we talk about cultures there's a tendency in the West to say, look, lots of cultures have more than two genders, and so that's a good thing. And then when you say, well, yeah, but let's look at these genders. These are really strict gender roles, and we would have problems with that, whether it's 2, 3, or 25. We tend to think people should be able to do whatever jobs they want to do and behave however they want to behave, and marry and sleep with whoever they want to, in the same way that we probably tend to think they should wear the clothes they want to wear. We just are a little less sure about that in our culture. And we still color code people, which I think is there's just something really funny about that. I just find that really, really funny.
It's very strange. it might phase out, you never know.
Or flip again, like it did in the past.
Exactly. I think that's it then. If there's no other questions, well, as usual, Bill, absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for lending your time to us again this afternoon. It was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure everyone else enjoyed it as much as we did. So we will hopefully have you back, Bill, next time. Our next program will be we'll be able to tempt you back. But before we go, we do wanted to say a special congratulations to you, Bill, because you got a Principal's Excellence Award today for the Development Trust Award for Philanthropy Alumni Engagement. And I think since this is Bill's 4th talk for our alumni since the pandemic began, it's a very, very well-deserved award. Well done, Bill.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Thank you again, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you at another event soon. And take care.
Bye-bye.